experienced lighthouse keepers, James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur, mysteriously vanished while operating the remote Flannan Isles lighthouse. The lighthouse, which is still standing today, is on the island of Eilean Mor, part of a small group of islands in the Outer Hebrides off the western coast of Scotland. It lies far in the north, an extremely remote and isolated lighthouse. Construction began in 1895, and it was fully operational by December 7, 1899. Only a year later, and its name would go down in history because of one of the eeriest vanishings of all time. Following other harrowing incidents, which we'll touch on later, it was decided in Britain that lighthouses needed 3 people operating them at all times. The Flannan Isles lighthouse had 4 keepers assigned, working rotating shifts of 6 weeks on and 2 weeks off. On December 15, 1900, a passing ship, the Archtor, noticed that the light wasn't lit. Lighthouse keepers James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur were supposed to be manning it at the time, while the 4th man, Joseph Moore, was away on the mainland. Given that weather conditions were poor, the lighthouse definitely should have been working to help guide ships around the northern coast of Scotland. The quickest way for the Archtor to send somebody to investigate was by completing its journey to Leith, Edinburgh, and reporting the strange occurrence to the Northern Lighthouse Board, or NLB. Unfortunately, poor weather continued. Nobody reached the island until 11 days later on December 26th, which is when the 4th keeper, Moore, went ashore, brought by the relief vessel Hesperus. To his dismay, all 3 of his fellow lighthouse keepers had vanished. He returned with 3 sailors who volunteered to help keep the lighthouse operating for the safety of passing ships. Moore and the crew investigated Eilean Mor properly after the initial landing, but they weren't able to find the other keepers. Only after the Hesperus had already been and investigated was the NLB given the information by the Archtor that, as early as the 15th, the lighthouse wasn't functional. Roderick Mackenzie, a gamekeeper on a more populated island, had been paid by the NLB to keep an eye on the lighthouse, and though Mackenzie didn't see the light for nearly 2 weeks, he failed to report this until the investigation had already started. During that investigation, Moore found that the light was in full working order, and he was able to get it lit as soon as possible. Everything would have been ready, in fact, for it to be lit on the night of December 15th. Inside the lighthouse, Moore also found that the clocks had stopped, and 2 sets of oilskins were missing. Only 1 remained. Oilskins are waterproof garments worn to protect the keepers from bad weather. These missing oilskins suggested then that 2 keepers had worn theirs out into a storm, while the 3rd had left his behind, perhaps having departed in a hurry. Both the front door and the gate were closed, however, so someone had left too quickly to put on their protective gear, yet had still taken the time to close 2 doors behind them. Moore also discovered that the date of the disappearance was December 15th. Spookily, the very same date the Archtor had passed and first noticed the light hadn't been lit. The logbook was up to date, as was the keeper's slate, which was used to record facts before being transferred formally to the log. It noted that all the work had been done on the morning of the 15th, as usual, like leaving the lamp ready to be lit. But while the lighthouse itself offered no clues, it was a different story when they examined the island's 2 landing places. The east landing was in perfect condition, but the west had suffered severe damage from the earlier storms. With all this in mind, the Northern Lighthouse Board wrapped up its investigation and came to the conclusion that the 3 men had perished at the western landing on the evening of December 15th. They'd finished their logs, storms had worsened, and by that very same evening, the absence of the light was noticed. It's commonly thought that they went to the western landing to stop equipment being destroyed because Thomas Marshall had previously been fined for lost equipment and so might have wanted to avoid a repeat punishment. The fine was 5 shillings, which would have been about 24 British pounds, roughly $29 today. Considering Marshall and Ducat were both experienced, it's possible that they thought venturing out into a storm was worth it to avoid the fines. A huge wave may have swept them away. There was evidence of damage high up at the western landing, bolstering this theory. It's then thought that MacArthur either left the lighthouse quickly to warn them of incoming waves, or to help them secure the equipment, and all 3 were taken by the sea. But what about those particularly sinister stopped clocks? Well, really, they likely had only stopped because they needed to be wound regularly, and had ticked down in the keeper's absence. This is not, however, the only possible explanation. Even at the time, the story was sensationalized, and interest has never completely waned. This was 1900, decades before alien abduction stories took hold of pop culture. But many other supernatural theories abounded, including that the 3 men could have been abducted by something else out of this world, such as a sea serpent, or worse, ghosts. Contemporary rumors blames the Phantom of the Seven Hunters, a malignant ghost ship said to haunt the Flannan Isles, which are also known as the Seven Hunters. Some say the keepers had angered supernatural forces on the island somehow. There also eventually emerged alleged excerpts from the keeper's logbook describing their supposed terror at the storm outside, with one of them even beginning to cry. But these additional entries turned out to be a hoax. Other theories stay a little nearer to reality. They speculate that the men got into a fight down by the cliffside. MacArthur was apparently known to have a short temper. Perhaps all fell into the ocean together. Even more violent is the idea that one of them could have murdered the other 2 and then taken his own life in the sea to cover up the crime. What do you think happened to the lighthouse keepers? Could a supernatural cause be to blame? Or was it all down to the raw power of the stormy seas? The Flannan disappearance isn't the only tragic thing to have happened at a lighthouse. The reason for the rule requiring 3 lighthouse keepers on duty was the Smalls Lighthouse tragedy of 1801. The first Smalls Lighthouse, which has since been replaced, was erected on remote, wave-washed rocks off the coast of Wales in the 1770s. In 1801, however, nearly a century before the Flannan Isles disappearance, one of the 2 keepers, Thomas Griffith, died in an accident. The other keeper, Thomas Howell, didn't want people to think he'd committed murder, so rather than dispose of Griffith's body, he kept it in a makeshift coffin over one of the windows. The arm of the body hung down where it was visible and moved in the wind. Slowly, Howell lost his mind, and though he was eventually rescued, he was never the same again. The Smalls Lighthouse tragedy was so horrific, it forms the basis of the acclaimed 2019 horror movie, The Lighthouse. If an episode of violence or madness was what affected the Flannan keepers too, then perhaps it speaks to the dangers of long periods of isolation in general, especially in such a hostile place. Since the 1990s, the UK's lighthouses have all been automated, and keepers only visit part-time to check everything is still working. We'll probably never know for sure what happened to the Flannan keepers, though if the Northern Lighthouse Board is right, its mystery may have been solved shortly after it happened. It's all down to whether you think that experienced lighthouse keepers would risk themselves to save their equipment, or whether you think something more sinister was going on. And that's what happened when 3 lighthouse keepers disappeared without a trace.